This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. So over the last couple of months, I've seen an explosion in Arctic geopolitical content, with analysts lauding the importance of everything from Greenland's minerals through the Svalbard global seed vault. And again, none of this is new. Even us here at the show, we even briefly talked about the Arctic and the new shipping lanes. It was one of the very first episodes of the program. And the reason we were talking about it back then is at the time, it seemed like it was going to be a big deal. This was around 4 or 5 years ago, and we were starting to see the first ice-free summers in the Arctic. But a lot can change over the years, and ever since, I can tell you, I've become more skeptical about most things. And a lot of that is largely due to one conversation I had a few years ago. You see, a few years ago I met with an individual, someone who wasn't a geopolitical analyst or a historian, but instead an insurance analyst. A man who, in all honesty, is probably the only person on this planet more jaded than I am. Ever since that conversation, his golden rule about the Arctic has always sat with me. And in all honesty, it's actually changed the way I think about everything from rare earth extraction to space mining. His golden rule in all of this was that if something sounds game-changing, and it could save big businesses money, those same businesses that would cut any corner they could just to save even a little bit of money, and those same businesses aren't taking up the offer that's been put on the table, well, then somebody is missing something. That if these developments in the Arctic really were game changers, then why isn't everyone jumping on it at the moment? Why is it that we have pretty reliable ice-free summers in parts of the Arctic, where for 1 to 2 months a year you no longer need to hire a $300,000 icebreaker escort, but yet shipping traffic along the Arctic routes is roughly the same as it was 5 years ago? That a whole bunch of these new deposits of rare earths and oil have been discovered in places like Greenland, and yet prior to the talk of independence, virtually no private mining companies have gone very far past just the exploration phase of these projects. Obviously, I'm not trying to be the nothing ever happens guy, because there are actually big developments happening here in the Arctic. So what are we missing about the Arctic at the moment? Why is that outside of just a few big audacious government projects, the markets aren't jumping at the opportunities that are being presented? And what would likely happen if Trump were to follow through with his invasion plans for Greenland, or Moscow would follow through with their invasion threats to seize Svalbard? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to take us through how we got here, as well as why a lot of these investors have become skeptical about the Arctic, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Breaking the ice.
Well, I would say in the Arctic context, we've had sort of a series of events over the last 5 years that have been particularly impactful. The first, I would say, was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which obviously has had significant impacts globally, but had a very specific impact in the Arctic context.
Jennifer Spence is the director of the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfast Center for Science and International Affairs, with expertise in sustainable development and the geopolitics of the Arctic region. Spence also currently chairs the Arctic Research Cooperation and Diplomacy Research Priority Team for the 4th International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, as well as having worked for the UN prior to that. So we're thrilled to have on the program today.
I think the economic question when it comes to the Arctic is quite interesting. There's a lot of conversations and growing narrative about the economic significance that's been there for some time around natural resources, whether it be oil and gas or rare earth minerals or other types of resource extraction. There's a huge fishery in the Arctic, and then questions around the potential for shipping routes in the Arctic. But I think it's really important to emphasize that a lot of these are all about future potential. The economic viability of a lot of these industries, with the exception of fisheries, which is extremely active now, is questionable. I mean, Norway obviously has a substantial oil and gas industry in the Arctic. Russia has a large infrastructure and development of its Arctic. But as a general rule, the potential for sort of substantial development, there's a lot of variables that are still at play.
This is probably not a bad place to start this chat today, unpacking one of the bigger misconceptions about this theatre as a whole. As whilst there's no shortage of conversation online about the vast deposits of oil and gas and even rare earth elements sitting just below the Arctic, the reality is that most of these resources are actually far from economically viable. And whilst claims about these resources are spiking, the actual extraction of them is still pretty minimal. The reason for which probably comes down to their prohibitively high extraction costs, as they all require extensive infrastructure in order to be built, require very specialized equipment and staff, and all the work needs to be done in extreme conditions with high insurance costs. As an example, some of the estimates we managed to get a hold of for this one suggest that extracting oil from the Arctic could cost anywhere between $100 to $250 per barrel to extract, which, when compared to the current oil price, hovering at somewhere around $70 a barrel, means that every barrel being extracted from the Arctic would result in a pretty significant financial loss for the operator, which explains why no one's clambering to do it. The only exception to this rule are some of the Norwegian and Scottish deposits further down toward the North Sea, as well as some of the Russian deposits, where there is some existing infrastructure already in place. Now, it doesn't mean these projects won't go ahead, particularly if some of these projects have state backing or involve companies with a very high risk tolerance. But in short, do you think it's these high extraction costs and the difficulty of operating up here that is preventing a lot of these companies from taking the leap and getting more financially invested up here in the Arctic?
That's absolutely right. This will still always be an extremely harsh environment to do business. The infrastructure is not there, as you point out, and the cost of building that infrastructure in order to make a lot of this economic investment viable is also extremely, extremely expensive.
There are some technologies that can somewhat help bring down the price of these operations, though. For example, ExxonMobil has been at the cutting edge of deepwater extraction tech that can be utilized very well up here, with ExxonMobil being heavily involved in drilling operations in Alaska. However, Arctic oil would really come into the conversation in the 2010s, when Russian oil company Rosneft and the US company ExxonMobil would sign a joint venture for exploration and developing oil and gas resources along the Russian Arctic. This deal being signed back in 2011, facilitated by a personal friend of Vladimir Putin, a recipient of the Russian Order of Friendship Medal, and Trump's future first Secretary of State nominee, Rex Tillerson. After signing the deal in 2011, Exxon and Rosneft would work together over the next few years, even jointly carrying out the exploration of the Arctic Pobeda oil fields in 2014. However, the deal would end up going south, as following the Russian invasion of Crimea and the subsequent sanctions placed on Russia by the Obama administration, ExxonMobil would be forced to pull out of the deal, resulting in a $1 billion loss for the company. And for Rosneft, without the Western tech required to do the exploration of these fields, Russia would also retreat from a lot of these projects. However, a few years later, it seemed that the deal might be back on the table back in 2016, when Rex Tillerson would be named as the new Secretary of State, even expressing interest in the two companies resuming their work. However, this deal would then be dismissed again when Tillerson was ejected from the Trump administration in 2018. So the fact that these two companies have worked together in the Arctic, and that they did see some sort of profitability when there is US tech combined with the easier to approach Russian deposits, suggests there might be some limited economic viability up here, if they can also get the politics to match up.
I do think that there are some people that have argued that there's an economic viability. We see that there's increasing economic or technological capacity to do these kinds of oil and gas extractions in more difficult environments. But there's still a lot of questions, both about not only the economic viability, but the environmental impacts of this and the extremely harsh environments that people will have to work in. And I think continually people underestimate that even this idea that climate change leads to ice-free Arctic makes people sort of assume sort of a Mediterranean in the north kind of environment, and that is not what you're going to experience. So any kind of resource extraction in that environment is incredibly difficult and extremely risky.
So we often discuss ice-free summers in parts of the Arctic, where as the ice continues to shrink, ships will no longer require escort via icebreaker to transit across the region. But at least in the near term, how feasible do you think it's going to actually be for ships to navigate through these waters with the same sort of ease they would through somewhere like the Indian Ocean? What are some of the logistical and operational challenges that shipping companies and military vessels are likely to face while trying to cross the Arctic, even during the summer months?
We talk about ice-free in the Arctic, and ultimately what we get out of that is sort of the idea that suddenly the ships are going to be sailing free through the Arctic in open waters. Ice-free does not mean there's no ice. It just means there's no permanent solid ice. There's still going to be floating ice, One of the questions that's been also raised is without the ice, you're going to have increased wave action. It could be extremely difficult. These are still extremely cold and extremely harsh environments. I've had experts explain to me that from the shipping industry that there's real concerns that with higher wave action, there's going to be issues and concerns with icing on the ships that is extremely difficult. So in some ways, even more difficult than a non-ice-free Arctic where you're using icebreakers. And then I think the fundamental issue is around certainty and predictability. And that is that, especially when we're talking about the shipping industry, these are businesses that really depend on knowing that they can get to point A to point B. All of these conversations about shorter sea routes completely ignore the inconsistency in the short shipping periods that really make this an unpredictable environment to function in. And then to top all of that off is the complete lack of infrastructure to support all of this envisioned economic activity, which is both an issue for having ports and communication infrastructure and search and rescue infrastructure. So, I mean, if there's ever an accident, or whether it be human life or an oil spill, there is not the capacity in the Arctic. These are huge spaces with very few people. This is not an easy environment to work in.
But yet, we still see a huge amount of talk online regarding the opening of these Arctic shipping routes, with some analysts touting these shortened travel times as a game changer for international trade. But I want to take a moment and take a look at these 3 proposed routes. And to help us visualize these routes, I want everyone listening to visualize a package being sent from the busiest port in Asia, Shanghai, to the busiest port in Europe, Rotterdam. Now, under normal circumstances, that package would likely take the conventional maritime route. That package would take the conventional maritime route southward, heading south through the Taiwan Strait, navigating around Singapore, crossing the Indian Ocean, and then transiting up through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, before then turning westward through the Mediterranean, around the Iberian Peninsula, into the English Channel, and then arriving at Rotterdam. Now, assuming we aren't making any stops along the way, traveling at an average speed of around 18 knots, and that we only waste about 24 hours getting through the Suez Canal, along this route we'll travel approximately 20,000 kilometers, and it will take roughly 26 days to do. However, with the Arctic shipping lanes becoming increasingly viable, our 3 northern routes begin to open up. The first of these routes being the Northwest Passage. Now, this route would see our vessel depart Shanghai, travel northward past Japan and into the Bering Strait, the strait that separates eastern Russia from western Alaska. Now, once we transit through that strait, we would then turn east along the north coast of Alaska, then running along the north of Canada, through Canada's northern archipelago, down the west coast of Greenland, before then entering the North Sea and the English Channel and pulling into Rotterdam. Now, once again, we'll assume that we're not making any stops along the way and that our ship is able to travel to 18 knots for the majority of the open water, only dropping down to 12 knots for these slower Arctic waters. And when we do the math on that, along this route, we'll travel only about 16,000 kilometers, with the journey taking roughly about 23 days, meaning we've shaved off 4,000 kilometers in about 3 days' time from the conventional route. Now, the second Arctic route is the Northeast Passage, also known as the Northern Sea Route. Now here, once we get into the Bering Strait, instead of turning east towards Canada, we end up turning west toward Russia, traversing across the East Siberian Sea, right along the north coast of Russia, before arriving at the north coast of Norway, following the Norwegian coast down the North Sea, and arriving at Rotterdam. Now distance-wise, this route is actually fairly similar, being about 15,500 kilometers long. So if we again assume we're not making any stops, keeping up our 18 knots for the open water, and 12 knots for the Arctic waters, this route's going to take us approximately 22 days to reach the destination, saving us around another 500 kilometers on the Northwest Passage and about 4 days on the conventional route. However, there is a third option, this one being the most extreme of the 3, as it would involve us sailing north to the Bering Strait and then transiting directly through the middle over the North Pole. Now, even though this route is theoretically the shortest, at just approximately 13,000 kilometers, it's also the most unpredictable due to persistent multi-year ice formations, a complete absence of permanent maritime facilities, and a short but admittedly widening window of time that this route can be taken. But again, if we apply the same math and assume we aren't making any stops, traveling at our average of 18 knots across the open ocean, and keeping up a mind-boggling 10 knots for these much more dangerous Arctic waters, the trip should only take around 21 days, saving us another 2,500 kilometers on the Northeast Passage, and being about 5 days quicker than the conventional route. Now, while there has been increasing discussion around this topic and the viability of Arctic shipping lanes, there's always one critical question that comes to my mind. That being that even though these routes are opening up more and more, how many shipping firms are actually actively rerouting their vessels away from the conventional southern route and toward these new northern routes? Do you think that explains part of the reason why we haven't seen the widespread adoption of these Arctic routes by the majority of the shipping industry?
The shipping industry is extremely well versed in how their industry works. And the calculations and variables they're taking into consideration, as you point out, aren't just about the distance and the use of fuel, because those are not the only variables they need to consider. And the thing is, again, you could say that in 10 years it'll be a bit easier. And I'm not saying there won't be any shipping. I'm not saying that there won't be any opportunities. I do think what we'll see is a lot more destinational shipping. We see a lot of smaller vessels, those types of things. There will be an increase in shipping activity and boating. But I think this idea that somehow this is going to be some alternative to major shipping routes to the south is unrealistic. The prospect of the Northwest Passage being a serious, viable, long-term option as a transit route are really sort of overblown. These are not easy trains. It's not mapped well. There isn't the infrastructure. There's a lot more that would need to happen other than changes in ice before this was at all feasible.
So one of the major reasons for this limited commercial adoption of the Arctic route probably comes down to cost. As whilst the reduced transit time is an advantage, it's not the only metric that most shippers are looking at. As whilst on one hand, when breaking down the numbers, you find that when combining the crew salaries, the administrative overhead, the fuel consumption, and a bunch of other sundry expenses, the cost per day ends up coming to around $50,000. So given that the Northern Sea route can save up to 4 days transit time, well, theoretically, it should be about $200,000 cheaper. In fact, in the comparison we're looking at here, it actually ends up being about $700,000 cheaper because of the estimated $500,000 cost for transiting through the Suez Canal. And there we go. Seems easy. So then why are most companies not using the route? Well, a large part of that answer is actually insurance. As for running a vessel carrying roughly $250 million worth of cargo, the insurance premiums on the conventional route typically hover at around $500,000. Whilst in contrast, the Arctic transit routes, due to their lack of search and rescue infrastructure, the prolonged response time for emergency recovery, the heightened operational hazards, and the risk that Russia may look to intervene in the route, means that any Arctic-bound vessel can easily add another $2 million in operational costs to the insurance to use the route, absolutely blowing out of the water any savings you would have gained from the 4 additional days.
Absolutely. What I think is very interesting is we can look at the insurance industry in a lot of ways as to telling us about risk. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change and the fact that there's now insurance companies that are no longer willing to insure in certain areas, not just in the Arctic, but in other parts of the world because of being in high risk zones from major weather events and floods and fires. And then you see the same thing for shipping in the Arctic. They're looking at all the variables and they're assessing all of these things. And that's a very strong signal that this is an environment that is not seen as a safe and predictable route.
And the problems don't just lie with insurance, as the shorter routes also have more chances to make money on that route, as the conventional routes in the south also have far more chances to make money back. As when examining the commercial route, well, that route benefits from running along quite a number of major transshipment hubs, allowing these vessels to maximize their revenue by stopping off in major ports like Ho Chi Minh, Singapore, and Mumbai, stopping to drop off cargo or pick up cargo, increasing the amount of customers and work that ship can do on the route. In contrast, there are almost no major ports all along that route the moment you get north of Japan, reducing the opportunities for intermediate trade and significantly limiting the profitability of the route. And these are just with the premiums as they sit today. If more people begin to use the Arctic, there also becomes a whole bunch of other problems that start up as well. An example being that the more people that use the Arctic route, well, the more chance that something goes wrong and one of their ships ends up sinking. And a loss of a vessel in the Arctic waters would almost certainly push those extreme premiums even higher. Moreover, while the conventional routes do have to travel through some routes with geopolitical instability, there are also routes that are full of Western and US bases that can come to the aid and support of any ship using the route. In contrast, if anything goes wrong on the Russian route, for nearly 80% of the journey, you're completely reliant on the Russian Coast Guard to come find you. And to further complicate things for the shipping companies here, you also have to take into account the weather, as whilst along the conventional route there are storms and monsoons, these are often far more predictable than some of the weather conditions in the Arctic. And if you're a company that sent a ship up into the Arctic and a random cold snap comes in, you're now stuck with the decision to either hire a $300,000 icebreaker to escort your ship through, or tell your ship to try and turn around and come all the way back round, both of which are massive expenses you'd have to build into your calculations here. Taken together, I think some of these factors explain why the Arctic route is still yet to emerge as a real commercial mainstay, even during the season where ice-free navigation is pretty much guaranteed now, which then raises the next question. If Russia knows that this is likely not going to be anywhere near as busy a route as some people say it will be, why is Russia putting so much effort into reinforcing the area, building new facilities, bases, and radar stations right across the region? What does Russia see that we don't?
Importantly, Russia's been forced relocating people to the Arctic for quite some time, and so that they certainly have not demonstrated any qualms about that. There are also people in the Russian Arctic who have lived there for thousands of years. The indigenous peoples in the Arctic have called it home for quite some time. But I think it's important to recognize, and this is always when we look at the military buildup in the Arctic, that all of Russia's infrastructure in the Arctic is dual purpose. And this is where their economy is. This is where they have resources. This is not a peripheral element of their economy. This is a core part of their economy. And so this should not be surprising to anyone that they would use it in the way that they do. And even when it comes to their military buildup in the Arctic, the military buildup serves multiple purposes.
So what about the other growing non-Western player here in the region, that being China, who now position themselves as a near-Arctic state, with Beijing even investing into projects like the Russian Yamal LNG project, Russia's Arkhangelsk deepwater port, and an environmental research station on Svalbard. But how aligned are China and Russia within this region?
In terms of China's interest, we saw with the release of the Polar Silk Road strategy an expression of interest from China. There's been a lot of controversy around their sort of articulation of themselves as a near-Arctic state, which has certainly been a point of some sensitivity for Arctic states. But what's interesting is there's been attempts at investments throughout the Arctic, but we actually see that a lot of those have either paused or failed because of a change in policy with the exception of Russia. With the other Arctic states, we've seen a real reticence to have that Chinese investment. And so there's been a real slowdown, if not a termination of a lot of that kind of infrastructure investment. I think the other thing to point out there, though, is even some of the major projects that Russia has hoped that China would invest in its Arctic have not necessarily come to fruition yet. So definitely the potential for an increasing relationship there. But again, I think sometimes the narratives that we're hearing in the Arctic context tend to be sort of generalized and don't sort of dig into the details of these things. I think that Russia will always want to be in control to some extent, and therefore that will limit that relationship, and it will encourage Russia to look for other opportunities with other partners, because ultimately China is the stronger partner in this partnership, and they don't want to see themselves completely dependent on China when it comes to being able to manage their own Arctic.
Now, one of the main reasons we're talking so much about the Arctic at the moment is probably somewhat due to the renewed interest of the US in the region, with the Trump administration expressing interest in either further investment or even annexing the Danish territory of Greenland. Now, we know Greenland is very important to NORAD, and we know it's important to the US's missile defense system, and that the US does already have bases situated on the island. But in your mind, is Greenland actually a centerpiece of this chessboard? If the administration came to you and asked where they should be placing their money and interest, where would you suggest?
Well, ironically, the best approach would be to invest in Alaska. There's still a lot more that could be done in terms of developing both economically and from a security perspective. They have a presence there, but there's certainly more that could be done, especially from an infrastructure perspective. I don't think that the role of Greenland is insignificant. I think it obviously, if you look at a map, Greenland is incredibly well positioned, or it holds a very important position geographically. But I don't think you need to own a country in order to have that relationship. And the US has had an extended relationship with Greenland from a military perspective for quite some time. So it's quite feasible to look at how you would expand that relationship if that is a concern that this administration has. From an economic perspective, I again can't emphasize enough that this is all extremely speculative. There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to the rare earth minerals that everyone has expressed interest in. At a recent hearing, you had experts in mining talking about a lot of the exploratory work that's still necessary to even assess the quality of a lot of those resources. And then there's, of course, we repeat again, the issues around infrastructure and the very difficult environment in which you would have to do this. And ultimately, any of the economic access you might have to Greenland is completely feasible without needing to own the country, but rather to build on a relationship with the Greenlanders.
Obviously, while this rhetoric around Greenland has somewhat soured relations between the US and Denmark, there is another actor up here that already have some tense relations with Washington, that being Canada, with the two of them having argued for many years now about the legal status of the Northwest Passage, a passage coming down from the Arctic and through the middle of all those almost completely uninhabited islands in Canada's north. Now, as part of this dispute, Canada claims that the Northwest Passage is part of its internal waters under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, granting Canada full control over transit and the right to enforce domestic laws on navigation through the area, as well as environmental protection and security provisions. On the other hand, the US has long argued that the passage is an international strait, meaning foreign vessels, including military ships, should enjoy a right of transit passage. In other words, they don't have to ask Canada for permission to transit through the waters. Now, this has long been a point of contention between the two, even reaching a boiling point during the Reagan administration when the US Coast Guard pushed their icebreaker Polar Sea right through the passage against the will of Canada. Now, since then, the issue has remained a somewhat background issue, as currently the passage is still a while off being suitable for any sort of major commercial shipping lanes. However, the passage is allegedly already in use by US submarines. So how do you think this dispute will go looking forward?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the UN Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS, sets out very specific rules about internal waters and exclusive economic zones and all those sorts of things. And all of the 5 Arctic states have put in claims, except the US has put in a claim, but they're not a signatory to UNCLOS, which is sort of an odd piece. But all of them have put in claims, which by definition will give sort of clear rules around sort of access to the management of shipping in those waters. Interestingly, it's actually through more of a contention between Canada and the United States around the Northwest Passage and whether or not those are internal waters or that should be seen as an international strait that is likely to be more contentious. And that has been currently is being managed more through agreeing to disagree and not dealing with it, which you can do because it's not particularly viable. So I would look more to the Northwest Passage as a place where it will be interesting to see how the situation evolves.
So it seems that, at least for now, it's not the shipping lanes or even the huge oil deposits driving this renewed interest in the Arctic region. And for now, it really seems to be more military and defense issues, with 2 separate NATO territories now increasingly seen as potential crisis points. The first of these being the Danish territory, Greenland, with its population already seeking independence for itself, but Denmark and the United States having very different visions of what that independence might look like. So how did Greenland arrive at this position? How serious are the US and Denmark toward Greenland? And what are the Trump administration's wider ambitions for the region? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The greener grass.
The massive degradation of relations between Russia and NATO countries, European Union countries, it created lots of issues within existing institutions. It's hard to overstate how degraded the relations have become from a diplomatic and otherwise perspective.
Nicholas Schwan is a senior defense and security analyst for RAND Europe, specializing in arms production, acquisition policy, and supply chain analysis for European northern defense and regional geopolitics. Prior to joining RAND, Nick worked on various projects for the UK Ministry of Defence, the UK Office for Security and Counterterrorism, the US Department of Defence, and the US Commission on Planning, regularly providing analysis on the Arctic region and the growing competition for trade in the north. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
So for now, we've got the Northwest Passage, and then we got the Transporter Sea Route. Transporter Sea Route obviously is going across, like literally in the middle of it. Still difficult to use because of the ice cap and lack of GPS coverage. Other things, Northwest Passage, which would be along the Canadian coastline, pretty tricky as well at the moment. Still to use, like a big lack of infrastructures.
So we see a lot of talk about these regions becoming more and more important over the next few years. But why haven't we seen a lot of businesses and shipping companies moving to take advantage of those months of the year when these shipping lanes open up?
Again, for multiple reasons. The main one is probably that, well, it's still a very austere and hostile environment to navigate. There is a lack of infrastructure, a lack of GPS coverage, lots of ice. It's very treacherous, lack of search and rescue capabilities, which means that to get insurance, it's very tricky. So it's not really used at the moment to an extent that would make a dent in the other trade routes, the other shipping lanes that we're using to get things from East Asia to Europe.
So we talked a little bit about this in the previous part, that while Arctic oil and gas extraction is technically feasible, when either done in some of the cheaper areas in the north of Russia or some of the more easily accessible offshore parts of the Arctic, as long as you can get the right combination of political will and specialized equipment, what about Arctic mining? Do you think it's also likely to face these same sorts of infrastructure challenges, with some of the fundamental issues being things like the lack of infrastructure, efficient transport resources out of the region, and by the time the necessary logistics and supply chains are actually established, well, there's actually a whole bunch of other markets in other places that are not only more cost-effective, less damaging to the environment, but also more operationally viable. If you're a mining company looking to get involved out here, do you think it does somewhat diminish the Arctic's appeal for large-scale mineral investments?
So that question is strongly related to climate change, obviously, because with global warming, that is uncovering entire regions where exploration is possible. So there is a lot of untapped potential, but it's still extremely difficult to operate in. Like if we speak of like Greenland, and you would see like pictures of Greenland and like minerals and oil and gas and all other rare earth deposits, literally like covering Greenland. But the thing is, we're speaking of regions where it's extremely hard to get people to work there. You have next to zero infrastructures for some parts of the area, and it would be extremely expensive and difficult to actually extract resources. So, for instance, you would see potentially around the Svalbard archipelago some oil and gas deposits, but even if the Norwegian government was keen to do this, it's still almost impossible.
So outside of the North Sea or fishing, how reliant are most of the Western nations on these Arctic regions at the moment for their oil and minerals?
I think it's still very minimal, practically inexistent for Western Europe and North America. They are not really relying on the Arctic for trade at the moment.
So what about China? Outside of the gas it gets from Russia, which is pumped down from this region, how reliant is China on places like Greenland or Svalbard?
China has definitely invested in this, and I think it has been, again, a bit of a boogeyman in the Arctic, is this idea of like China and Russia hand in hand in the region to challenge the established order, to give like an Arctic version of what they are doing elsewhere, if you will. This might be slightly overstated in the sense that it's fair to say that China has explored the possibility of using the Northern Sea Route, and we saw an increase of like licensing or permits to operate in the region from Chinese ships. But if you look closer at the details, you realize that the overwhelming majority of those ships are actually for fishing. It's hard to insist, again, too much on the fact that shipping and trade is still at a very, very low level.
So really, until insurance comes down, we're effectively looking at this being more of a specialty destination shipping area, mostly running routes like nickel out of Dudinka or Murmansk, and those resources being then directly transported to buyers in places like South Korea and China. These being specialty ships carrying mostly one material, rather than the standard conventional ships usually carrying lots of a whole bunch of materials. So if that is the case, and the concerns around Chinese flotillas coming down from the Arctic may be somewhat exaggerated, what are the US interests in this region? Why has Greenland become so important to Washington in recent months?
We need to preface everything by saying that for them, the Arctic and the status of Greenland is national security. It is homeland security. For them, it is an essential part of NORAD. It is an essential part of Homeland Security. So there is a sort of very defensive approach to it. But now, more concretely, why so much agitations around Greenland? I mean, it's partly due to the fact that the territory is heading for elections this year. And we are seeing that the issue of independence, that has been around for a long time, it's becoming quite real in different ways, because basically all the major parties that are running are pretty much pro-independence. The spectrum you need to adopt for the Greenland politics, it goes from more autonomy to full and immediate independence and things in between. But we are really speaking of a territory that is seriously exploring the idea. And the situation we're at is that you've got the United States on one hand that already has military base, which is the core component of NORAD for early warning for whatever comes from Russia. And on the other hand, you've got the Kingdom of Denmark, to which Greenland is part of, with the central government in Copenhagen, obviously, which is promising to the United States that they are going to be able to keep having a military presence, that they're going to keep their alignment with the United States, that they have nothing to be afraid of. But at the same time, you've got the local government in Greenland that is constantly speaking about independence, which obviously means that, well, any promise from the central government of the Kingdom of Denmark is conditioned by the fact that Greenland is still part of it. But what about if it's not anymore? And I think we're going back to really like first principles of international relations almost. When it comes to the defense of their own territory, things tend to become non-negotiable for states. And I believe it's a bit what we're seeing with the US right now and Greenland. It's like they are really upping the ante and putting pressure to say that they are never going to let Greenland really get away from their security complex because it's so essential for them.
Well, let's take a look at some of those US positions, as the United States currently maintains several strategic installations across Greenland. And so everyone can somewhat visualize it, I want everyone to imagine Greenland as roughly the shape of a slice of pizza pointed downwards. Now, if we work our way up the left-hand side of that pizza, about a third way up the coast we'll find the capital city Nuuk, with its population of about 19,000 or 30% of Greenland's inhabitants. If we then move about 160 kilometers north from there, we come across Kangerlussuaq, a location that had previously been moved on by the US, with Washington covertly setting up a US weather station during World War II. However, today, this site operates as a primarily dual-use logistical node, primarily supporting scientific research, and home to one of the only aircraft that the Danish military maintains on the territory. Now, if we keep going up that left-hand side, about 240 kilometers, we find the remnants of Camp Century, clandestine Cold War-era project designed as a subsurface ice tunnel network to contain nuclear missiles. However, as the range improved on the US ballistic missile program, the base was abandoned in 1969. However, the absolute crown jewel of the US positions here in Greenland is the Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. Positioned nearly 3/4 of the way up the left-hand side of our pizza, about 1,200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. Now, the reason that Pituffik is so important is that it not only has a very large runway, at its peak housed about 10,000 people, and is situated only about a 3.5-hour flight from Russia's northern coast, but Pituffik also anchors NORAD's early warning architecture, with its phased array radars providing continuous monitoring against ICBMs. Now, these days the US contingent on the base is much smaller, only housing about 400 to 600 personnel in total, with many of those actually just being civilian contractors working for the military. So if the US were to carry out some sort of invasion, there probably isn't enough already here on the territory to carry out the kind of shock and awe campaign the US usually advocates for. Meaning that if war were to happen, it's pretty unlikely these soldiers would be ordered to march the 1,900 kilometers southward down the west coast of a territory that has little to no roads connecting anything. But seeing as Greenland's going to the poles in a couple of days, and independence seems to be the talk of the town, what do you think the new government status around these bases is likely to be? Do you think we might see Greenland drift toward NATO once again? Or are there other options that Greenland might start looking into?
I think we should feel relatively safe. It seems quite obvious that they would have lots of advantage to align themselves with NATO. But obviously, there is absolutely nothing certain. And obviously, Russia and China in the shadows, ready to take advantage of the situation, potentially, at least in the eyes of NATO countries. This is not a very reassuring prospect. I think this is a prospect that makes many people a bit uncomfortable, and that's probably why we are seeing preemptive pressure. I think we saw from the current government, they formulated it as that they want to work with everyone. They don't want to be American, they want to be Greenlandish, and that they are absolutely ready to keep the good relations going with everyone.
Now, Greenland's shift toward independence has also become more complicated in recent months, shaped by a whole slew of political and economic realities. But the independence movement had been gaining significant traction in recent years, and as things stand, the Siumut Party, who's a key player in the ruling coalition, has outlined plans to hold a referendum on independence for the territory, if they're put back into government. Whereas the IA Party, who's currently leading the coalition government, is currently advocating for a more measured approach to the problem, highlighting some of the broader risks that could come with it. Particularly as things stand, Greenland actually gets a fairly good deal under the current arrangement with Denmark, paying no tax to Denmark, while Denmark pays about 2/3 of the state's budget. And even some of the other major gripes are starting to be addressed by Denmark, with Copenhagen even recently promising to invest a further $2 billion worth of infrastructure onto the territory. However, the polls give a slightly different story, as a poll taken in Greenland in 2025 indicated that whilst 84% of Greenlanders now favour independence, a figure up from 62% in 2019, 45% of the country would oppose it if it led to a lower standard of living. And on top of that, almost 90% of the territory opposes annexation by the United States. So with that in mind, as things currently stand, are they still likely to push independence, even though it may result in a reduction of funds coming in from Copenhagen, or even annexation by a foreign power?
It's very high, because the current coalition is in favor of independence. When you see all the parties that are polling quite high, they are pretty much all in favor of independence. It's just a matter of how and following which process and under which conditions. But I think we're in a situation where practicalities of independence are seriously being discussed, and we do have big question marks on how could Greenland be viable as an independent country.
Okay, so if that's the case, it wouldn't be out of the question that they start looking at other partners around the world and seeing what kind of deal they can get. But let's play it out here and imagine a bit of a crazy scenario. Let's imagine that Trump's claims that he's going to get Greenland one way or the other are referring to a full aggressive military invasion of the territory. Because if he did so, it actually opens up a few legal questions. Now, if such a scenario unfolded, Copenhagen's first likely response would be to look toward NATO. First, they'd have to go through Article 4. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of what Article 4 does, Article 4 states that the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity or political independence or security of any parties is threatened, which in practical terms would mean that NATO countries meet together to discuss how to respond to something. Now, whilst Denmark would likely initiate consultations with other NATO members, these consultations would obviously include the United States, and it goes without saying that it's pretty unlikely the US is going to declare war on itself. Well, probably not over Denmark anyway. So what about moving straight to Article 5, the cornerstone of the Collective Defensive Treaty? The trouble is that Article 5 doesn't actually automatically extend to all overseas territories of NATO member states. And this means that Greenland, a Danish autonomous territory, introduces a bit of ambiguity regarding whether Article 5 should be responded to or not. In addition, even if Denmark were to invoke Article 5 to NATO, well, then the NAC would have to meet, the NAC being the North Atlantic Council, with the process being that the NAC would then debate the response together, with the final decision also requiring unanimous vote, and the United States still being at the table. So NATO's probably not the route to go here. So what other options did Denmark have open to it? Well, what about the European Union? After all, Article 42 of the Treaty of the European Union explicitly states, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other members shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance. So we'll put aside for a moment that the actual wording here would actually only require most of these European states to donate even just a single dollar, as that would probably meet the legal definition of aid, as there'd be another even bigger problem to overcome in this one. That problem being that, well, even though Denmark is, Greenland is not actually a member of the European Union. In fact, Greenland voted to withdraw from the European Union, well, back then the EEC, back in 1985, meaning that Article 42 is pretty unlikely to apply. Therefore, Denmark's legal and geopolitical recourse in this situation is pretty limited, and there's not too many organisations it can rely upon without starting some sort of defence pact themselves. So with these constraints put upon it, what viable strategic and military options do you think Denmark would realistically have open to them if the US were to carry out an invasion of the territory?
Denmark has quite limited defense capability. I mean, it is a rich but small country, and it has huge maritime territory. to take care of, right? Because of the Faroe Islands and Greenland, obviously. So a huge exposure to a region that has seen an increase in geopolitical tensions, an increase in military activities. So the situation we are in now is also a bit difficult and challenging for the Danish military forces because they would have to patrol a huge maritime territory with like a couple of frigates and that are probably not sufficient for the mission they have assigned. So I think whatever goodwill they would have in the future, it would be extremely hard from a material perspective for Denmark to ramp up their military presence there. Not lack of will, just lack of material capabilities.
So yes, the US could militarily take the territory. And yes, there's very little legally or materially that the Danish could do to throw the US off once they'd taken it. But with both the Danish and Greenland authorities already promising the US that they can keep their bases, both sides encouraging mining companies to invest in the region, and even on occasions like the Tan Breeze project, bending to US requests to block the sale of the mine to a Chinese company and end up selling it toward a US company at a fraction of the price. As well as the fact that the rare earth deposits in Greenland are not only not even economically proven yet, but that the US could find deposits of these same rare earths within areas it's actually cheaper to extract from in places like California, Wyoming, or Texas, unless there was an imminent threat like Russia had landed a force on the other side of the territory. Do you think the political flack and long-term reputational damage that would come from the US doing this would be worth the benefits you'd gain from occupying a territory like Greenland?
In the present situation, definitely not. I don't think this move would make any sort of sense right now. But the thing is, obviously, it really depends on what happens in the rest of the world.
So from what it seems, the US could technically invade Greenland. They could also probably pretty easily occupy it. But by doing so, what will be the reputational damage? And how much of a financial burden is it likely to become on the United States? As from what it seems, economically, invading Greenland is pretty much like breaking into your neighbour's house to steal his 1996 Chrysler Dodge Neon. As not only are you stealing from one of your neighbours, but it's also likely to cost you more in repairs than you ever thought just to keep the thing running, whilst also coming with a bunch of reputational damage. As it becomes hard to criticise China if they go for Taiwan, or Russia if they go into the Baltics, if you're also sitting there gobbling up nearby territories. So for now on this issue, it really seems like we only have a couple of half-answered questions. The first being that while the polls show that the majority of Greenlanders do favour independence from Denmark, they also overwhelmingly show, at nearly 90%, that they do not favour being annexed by the United States. With the polls also not showing whether the Greenlanders who voted for independence would be willing to go through with it if it also meant giving up the substantial subsidies currently being provided by Copenhagen. On top of that, there's also another massive critical issue. This being the fact that even if all these problems were solved, and Greenland's rare earth deposits are what they claim is in the ground at the moment, the region still lacks the infrastructure, expertise, and accessible logistics needed to actually get to them and exploit them economically. As right now, the entire territory is simply just expensive to work in. Just go back and look at some of the figures on how expensive it was for the US to build their airbase in the country. And now imagine trying to do that in the private market where you're paying interest, and a whole bunch of other rare earth mines around the world are all opening up to undercut you on price. And with that being the case, why would we expect any sane US mining company to invest massive amounts of money into mines in Greenland when they could simply just extract those minerals more cheaply from places in Africa, more reliably from places in Australia, or more cheaply and more reliably from places within the United States? To me, that's a pretty big hurdle to get over, and one that's probably going to continue to be a headache for the United States, Denmark, and the other NATO states. And unfortunately for those guys, it also isn't the only headache up here in the Arctic, with another NATO state's territory also raising some geopolitical questions at the moment. And to take us through it, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Fish and wedges.
Having Finland and Sweden inside of NATO is obviously a huge military benefit. For the first time for many years with new member states, they actually bring military hardware and infrastructure. If you look at that from a Russian side, in case of an eventual conflict in that area, it just makes life so much harder because you have so many more targets to hit.
Sigbjørn Halsny is a staff officer with the Norwegian Armed Forces and the head of section at the Land Power War Studies Department of the Norwegian Military Academy and Norwegian Defence University. Prior to that, he was also a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies, serving as an expert in Arctic warfare and Northern European defence. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Sweden is not connected to the Barents Sea and that part of the area, neither is Finland. They're both really Baltic Sea states. Their centres of gravity are more along the Baltic coast and the Baltic Sea. And up north, Finland has a large, still conscripted mobilization land power, but most of that is actually positioned in the south of Finland because that's where their major cities and infrastructure is.
So I think a pretty good place to start the conversation here is, in your opinion, what are Norway's primary defence threats and concerns? What's at the core of the strategy here?
For Norway, the main centre for military activity has always been north, and that has been the case throughout. We've seen a slight shift in air base structure in the last few years, making fewer bases after the Cold War, but that is also a lot of that activity has happened up north. So that has been the main focus, and in particular for the Norwegian intelligence service, obviously, to keep tabs on what is going on the Kola complex for the Russians. So that has more or less been a mainstay.
Well, let's take a moment and unpack the Russian position here for a moment, as this northern area of Russia is actually a primary focus for them as well, and a large part of the Russian bastion defense doctrine, as not only do these northern bases contain the largest of Russia's 6 fleets, a number of comparatively well-armed marine, air defense, rocket, arctic and mechanized brigades, but they also contain quite a number of air bases and missile facilities that make up the core of the Russian nuclear deterrent. So for Norway, looking eastward toward the Kola Peninsula, they have to contend with what were large units at one point, like the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade, being positioned just 11 kilometers from the Norwegian border. In fact, in just the recent years, Russia has actually put a lot of effort into upgrading their Arctic facilities, with their facilities at places like Polar Star getting massive upgrades, Temp Air Base being opened up again, Nagorskoye having a new runway added to it, and Russia even running aerial operations above the North Pole from this facility. With all of this going on top of major upgrades to Rogachevo, Oliena, and the Tinfor facilities. Now, the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade is probably a bad example here, reportedly reduced to around 20% of its actual strength, having been pretty badly mauled in Ukraine. But having all these Russian units so close to the Norwegian border, is that something that concerns Norwegian defense planners like yourself?
To be frank, the land force footprint for the Northern Fleet in all the way up north in Russia is pretty limited. They've said now that they are going to reinforce with Finland into NATO and Sweden as well, but we haven't seen it. So there's really in reality 3 brigades, 2 motorized infantry brigades and a naval infantry brigade in that area. And they are mostly concerned with actually protecting the Kola complex. So the offensive capabilities, unless they move air assault and air mobile forces, is limited in that area. What they do have is a rather big strategic bombers force and obviously a naval power settled in that area. So there's traditionally not the big exercises like Svalbard and the others you see. They typically do not happen in that area.
So we know that the Russian offensive capability out here has been a bit reduced, but let's take a quick look at Norway's position for a moment, as the Norwegian Armed Forces have actually stationed some pretty substantial military assets in the region, including multiple specialised units pretty far north of the Arctic Circle, even though that only a small percentage of Norway's population actually lives this far north. With assets up here including things like armoured, mechanised and special ranger units, and several additional battalions stationed up here in the northern regions. And this pattern also extends to other branches of the military as well, with the Royal Norwegian Navy having its Coast Guard up here, and the 131st and 133rd Air Wings, alongside a maritime helicopter wing, also being based pretty far to the north. Yet what I do find interesting about this is that when looking at where these bases are deployed, there are only a very small amount of them actually being deployed along the 196-kilometer land border with Russia. These 2 units appearing to just be the Jägerkompaniet, a border ranger company, and a handful of Norwegian border guard personnel stationed at Høybuktmunnen. So what I want to ask you is, can you unpack why this decision's been made? That whilst a lot of Norway's armed forces infrastructure has been moved pretty far to the north, there's only a very small amount of it that's up right along the Russian border. Is this being driven by political considerations, or is it more of a calculated assessment that if you ended up in a war with Russia, that it would be pretty difficult for Russia to advance the nearly 900 kilometers from the Russian border to the main bases on the North Sea coast?
So Norway has a mechanized brigade in northern Norway, which is distributed over the two northern provinces. So part of it is in Finnmark, which is the province bordering and shares a border with Russia. That is the border guards. And there is a combination of light infantry and mechanized forces some 60, 70 kilometers south. That is very tough terrain, that area. Only 2 axes of advance on the land side and smaller airfields. And then the main bulk of that brigade is actually situated a bit further south, but still in the north of Norway. The main reason really harks back to the Norwegian policy during the Cold War as well, where Norway pursued a policy of deterrence on one side, having a strong defense and a membership in NATO, but also of reassurance on the other side that Norway would not be a sort of springboard for a NATO attack on Russia, which means that we put some limitations on where we put our own forces, 2 heavy forces, and also where we allowed allies to do from Norwegian bases and how far to fly out from Norwegian bases, etc. That is all changing now with Finland in NATO, so these things are looked over. And the second part is that there is a operational dilemma when you look at a potential high-intensity war with Russia, and that is right across the border from Norway is the Kola Peninsula with the Northern Fleet space. It's one of the best protected areas with a high degree of sophisticated anti-air defense or air defense systems and anti-ship missiles, coastal-based missile defense systems. So you're basically inside the anti-access area denial umbrella of the forces potentially in that area. So being really forward positioned in times of crisis or in peacetime also puts your forces largely at risk if something escalates. And there is a balance to be struck both in terms of escalation management and in risk. And it's a sparsely inhabited part of the area with very strong defensive terrain, so that also plays into that.
Now, as things stand, Norway currently maintains 4 overseas territories, as well as a large claim in Antarctica. 2 of those territories, Peter I Island and Bouvet Island, are both located in the southern Antarctic Ocean, whereas Jan Mayen, between Norway and Greenland, as well as Svalbard, to the north of Norway and the northwest of Russia. Now, the one we're going to be mostly focusing on today is Svalbard, a cold, rocky archipelago of islands about 700 kilometers north of Norway. Now, Svalbard is particularly interesting for this scenario as it has an odd governance structure. This odd structure stemming from the Svalbard Treaty, signed in 1920, where while operational control of the archipelago lies with the Kingdom of Norway and gives them rights to act as the regional administrator, the treaty also provides unique provisions that anyone from any nation in the world may not only visit, but also live and work freely in the territory. So anybody from any country can come here and work, no questions asked. In addition to that, the treaty also maintains an open port policy, allowing countries like Russia to start coal mining operations on the archipelago and export that coal back to Russia. And as another oddity of the treaty, the archipelago also has no permanent military presence being permitted. So whilst anyone can come and work on the island, no one can be pre-positioned to defend it. Now, this legal oddity meant that until actually quite recently, whilst the archipelago was part of Norway, its population was actually majority Soviet, with the Soviet Union and then subsequently Russia capitalizing on the arrangement by establishing mining settlements in Barentsburg, Pajmareiden, and Grumant. For Moscow, the primary driver being the coal industry, with the Soviet state-owned coal company Arctic Ugol operating extensive mining facilities here in the archipelago. At its peak in the 1980s, the USSR maintained a pretty significant civilian workforce on the island, made up of about 1,000 Russian and Ukrainian citizens. However, that would change after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Moscow no longer had the funding to keep a lot of these projects going. So after the collapse and the subsidies were slashed, these Russian mining operations up here became increasingly unprofitable. And consequently, many of the residents who were living up here returned back home, leaving some of these settlements that had been established by the Russians in the Cold War now abandoned, with Grumant being pretty much abandoned even before the end of the Cold War, and Pajmareiden, a once thriving community, was all but shut down in 1998. Today, the only major Russian center on the archipelago is in Barentsburg, with the Russian population now down to around 400 to 500 people, these being primarily miners and some support staff. Although admittedly, Moscow has started to transition away from this coal mining and increasing its presence of scientific personnel on Svalbard. As a result, these days, the archipelago, which was at one point almost 60% made up of Soviet citizens, is actually only now around 10 to 20% Russian these days. However, being Russia, that doesn't mean that Russian interest has left the area, with Russia adopting a bolder stance toward the archipelago even just a few years ago. As in recent years, Russia has increasingly criticized Norway for imposing fishing restrictions on part of Svalbard's waters. And as recently as 2020, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov even went as far as to send a formal letter demanding that Norway lift what Russia described to be unfair limitations to Svalbard's resources and waters. Now, Norway for its part remains pretty vigilant about its claims on the waters, even going as far as to seize vessels from Spain, Latvia and Russia itself for illegally fishing within the jurisdiction, something that Russia has seen as an escalation to the situation. So in your opinion, if Norway is starting to increase its claim over the islands, do you think it ever would cross that line and actually look to establish a permanent military presence on the archipelago?
The reason for Norway having a rather small footprint, well, part of it is it falls back to the end of the Cold War, where the Norwegian army was reduced in size, which Finland never did. The other part, if we're talking about Svalbard specifically, is that it's actually not that strategically important. It's been deemed up through the years. And it's Norwegian sovereign territory, but it's governed by the Svalbard Treaty from 1920, which actually puts limitations on what you can do. So there is a limitation on having naval bases, having fortifications and using the island for warlike purposes. And that has been normally by Norway addressed to quite strictly. So you have no permanent military presence on Svalbard due to that fact.
But while Norway does stick with the treaty, Russia in recent years has tried to skirt somewhere around it, where as recently as February 7th, 2022, undersea communication cables that connect Svalbard to the rest of Norway were reportedly damaged by an underwater vehicle, suspected to be Russian, with Russia likely to have gone after the cable as the Svalbard Satellite Station, or Svalsat, whilst being a civilian facility, is also pretty important to a lot of European defence agencies, giving Moscow some incentive to act upon the archipelago. Now, because of this, I want to pose a bit of a scenario to you here. That way we can unpack all this a bit more. Let's say Putin wakes up a few years from now and decides that he wants to expand Russia by seizing the Svalbard archipelago. To get us started, what do you think would be the advantages of him doing so?
If we look a few years up the lane and we project that the war in Ukraine is finished, Svalbard might be an interesting politically strategic test bed for the Russians to sort of dip their toes into the water if they sense that NATO is not quite aligned, or they might start testing how that alliance cohesion is. That could be used for a case of more of those hybrid threats. But even for both Russia and Norway, there's not that big a military strategic gain on Svalbard.
So let's play this scenario out a bit and imagine that Putin is willing to go for this. Now, from what I can see, there are probably two plausible options for how to invade Svalbard. The first being more of a conventional military operation. This one likely revolving around Russia launching a naval expeditionary force from its key Arctic bases in Murmansk and Severomorsk, both of which are situated roughly half the distance compared to Norway's primary naval base at Håkonsvern. Now, under this option, Russian naval forces or amphibious forces could reach the archipelago within about a day, swiftly landing a battalion or detachment-sized force of either specialised or airborne units, and due to the fact that Norway has no military personnel in the archipelago, would probably pretty rapidly seize everything, likely securing the capital and major port before Norway can really mount a counter-response. So that's option one. Option two would probably be something more subtle, something closer to Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, where Russia would use little green men to seize the archipelago, likely gradually infiltrating personnel into Svalbard in the weeks preceding the operation, these personnel being disguised either as civilian tourists or coal mining workers, with Moscow using its coal mining operations as cover for smuggling in small arms, ammunition and supporting equipment in preparation for the attack. So with those two options on the table, if it were you advising the Kremlin on how to pull this off, which one would you recommend?
So it depends. Svalbard could be a test bed. If you have some assumptions that NATO might be divided, somebody wouldn't be willing to fight over Svalbard or something else, and you want to weaken that alliance cohesion, Svalbard is a place you can start playing with that. And then you can start using the Crimea scenario. You can put in small green men in some of the Russian settlements in Svalbard. You can start accusing Norwegian police of abusing or unlawfully prosecuting Russian citizens, and you can play up that whole scenario and see how the others in the alliance response and how Norway responds to that. And that would be my first off. And then with a series of plans to escalate or de-escalate, whether the situation was favorable for my end goals or not.
So let's fire you from Moscow and put you back with the Norwegians. If you were sitting in Oslo and you were worried that something like this was a possibility, as the Norwegians, what would you be on the lookout for? What are the warning signs?
Well, I think you'd look overall, first of all, at everything happening in the hybrid domain. Is there an increased focus? Are there preparations being done, which you can say are preparations to set forth a moving to the next phase of a conflict? How's the readiness of this? Are there moving type Propushkas and Ivan Grens, the amphibious landing crafts? Are the naval infantry embarking? Are VDV forces on higher readiness? All those things you would necessarily look at as triggers for conflict. And that combined with the geopolitical situation around is the biggest narrative and what most people agree on is that there are few strategic interests for Russia in this region which would make them go to an outright war for the way we see in Ukraine or maybe in the Baltics. But what you could have is them picturing a high threat with a conflict with NATO or the US or any bilateral combination of that, where they feel they need to deepen their defenses around the Kola Peninsula and set this bastion defense, as it was often called in the Cold War. And that would involve Norway, whether they had strategic gains in that area or not.
So before we really sink into the details in our scenario, when looking at an Arctic warfare campaign like this, can you take us through some of the difficulties an army is likely to go through when trying to plan for something this far north?
We usually say when we have allied training that if you're dumped in the desert or in the jungle and you make every mistake in the book, you're dead within a week. If you're dumped in Finnmark in northern Norway in January and you make every mistake in the book, you're dead by 2 to 3 hours. The climate is unbelievably harsh. There's no daylight apart from 2 hours a day during the winter. And in the summer, it's light all day around. It can get really cold. And in the coast, it can get really windy, wet, and then really cold. So it's just incredibly difficult terrain to operate in. In addition, all satellites clear the horizon less unless you have dedicated communication satellites, which are geostationary, which most nations don't have. So your comms are not working properly. You have all the northern lights messing with your electromagnetic spectrum and the rest of your comms. For aircraft, you get icing. You get ice on runways, which is why Norwegian fighters usually have parachutes, drag chutes to make them stop quicker, which is a challenge if you come in with heavy flights or you don't have that piece of equipment. You get icing on the airframes themselves, and quite often you have so bad weather you can't operate drones, helicopters, or aircraft at all. And with naval vessels, you get all the problems with icing, proper clothing, whether your equipment is working the way it should for carriers, the flight decks ice. It's just a host of problems that makes life really, really difficult. And unless you've trained a lot in that environment, and we see on the land side, the British Royal Marines, the Dutch Royal Marines, they rotate to Norway regularly to train, and that they actually come up to a level where they master it. But quite a lot of other allied forces who come on winter training for winter NATO exercises in Norway, they have enough just to survive and will struggle to be a capable fighting force in those conditions during the winter.
Okay, so let's consider our scenario involving the Grey Zone operation, where Russia plans to use private contractors and unmarked special forces operators to take and seize the archipelago. Something that might be a little easier than you assume, considering almost the entire population is concentrated in just 3 towns. Now, due to the unique governance surrounding Svalbard, Russian personnel could be pre-positioned on the archipelago well in advance, and all of this would be relatively simple. In fact, you could probably do it without raising many alarms. However, whilst the population is concentrated in just a few towns, there's also no infrastructure connecting those towns together. So whilst we'd probably expect the contractors to begin their operation from the mostly Russian town of Barentsburg, the capital of Svalbard, Longyearbyen is located approximately 40 kilometers to the east, with no direct road connection between the two settlements. This logistical challenge means that without access to a large number of helicopters, armoured vehicles, or all-terrain transports, any operation the Russians launch would probably require the Russian forces to establish a presence on both locations simultaneously. As whilst Barentsburg has the majority Russian population, Longyearbyen has the port you'd probably need to bring more materials and supplies in. Now, whilst Russian operatives probably can't openly arrive in town with military equipment, previous wargaming scenarios on this situation have shown how weapons can be smuggled into the territory via cooperation with the Russian coal companies, which make regular trips to the archipelago to drop off materials and pick up coal. So these regular cargo shipments between Barentsburg and the Russian ports do provide somewhat of an opportunity to clandestinely move small arms and light equipment under the guise of coal transport operations, making the scenario somewhat plausible to envision that Russian operators here would probably have access to a limited range of small arms. But what I want to ask is, what about more substantial equipment? Could Russia, let's say, try and circumvent these restrictions and make this invasion easier for them by ordering a helicopter to the islands under civilian pretext?
You have the Svalbard Treaty, which says actually what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do, and stuff you're allowed to bring or not. Obviously, you can repurpose helicopters and stuff, but if you start in bringing heavy machinery, well, that can be done clandestinely. But if that is discovered, it's dealt with by the police.
Now, under normal circumstances, the Norwegians have rules stating that they cannot use their armed forces on the islands. However, in the past, they have regarded their Coast Guard as not technically part of the military, and therefore the Coast Guard can operate within the islands. So do you think if there were a concern by Oslo that the Russians were building up on the islands, and that Russia was about to do something rash, do you think the Norwegians might look to use their Coast Guard to clandestinely place their own forces and pre-positioned weapons?
So under normal circumstances, this fall under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Justice, which is the Coast Guard is a part of. And the police is actually in charge of both Norwegian, Russian, and everyone else's citizen on Svalbard. And that's how it's played out in crisis management. And that's how it would be played out in that case as well. If then actually there is a situation where you are in an armed conflict, the Coast Guard falls under the armed forces, and then it's a different case. But they have a very limited military capability.
Okay, so let's say for the Russians, the uprising unfolds pretty successfully. They start a riot on the island, local police respond with force, and the unmarked Russian operators spring into action using the justification of protecting Russians. And within a few hours, Russian forces have secured the port and the two primary settlements on Svalbard. Now, obviously, we're going to discuss the broader NATO response a bit later, but I want to focus on the initial reaction that Norway is likely to have, as obviously they'll want to kick the Russians off, but it's actually more difficult than I think a lot of people assume. You see, one of the first major challenges is likely to be the operational limitations posed by the Arctic conditions, as conducting sustained air operations here in the high north presents some pretty significant logistical challenges. For one, Svalbard is nearly 1,700 kilometers north of Norway's primary airbase at Ørland, placing it well beyond the combat range of Norway's F-35s. So without transferring a bunch of men and material to a northern base, or bringing in aerial refueling capabilities, providing air power that far north is going to be a bit of a challenge. Whereas when we take a look at the Russian position, they're geographically in a much better spot, even if their aircraft carrier is pretty constantly on fire. Because as things stand, Longyearbyen is only about 1,000 kilometers away from Murmansk and about 700 kilometers away from Trefoil, giving Russia a pretty significant operational advantage, and placing Svalbard within the strike range of Russia's more modern Su-35s, MiG-31s, and Tu-22s. So given this imbalance, to what extent does this concern Norwegian military planners at the moment?
So in terms of covering with air power, Norway obviously is a long way over, and there's a limit of air-to-air refueling for both NATO, and Norway doesn't have that nationally. And that would also be a stretch for Russia, which doesn't have a carrier functioning at the moment and need to operate from their bases, either from the mainland or from the North Siberian Islands, where they have some bases. Yes, it's Norwegian sovereign territory, but it's not where we operate the military forces the most. So they're purposed for other missions. There is a lack of that in all of NATO, air-to-air refueling. We know that is a capability gap. Same with naval logistics. Many of these systems are so hugely expensive, say air-to-air refueling or AVACs, that is really enough for smaller nations such as Norway, Finland, Sweden to run those on your own. That's why you have the NATO programs for that. So it's partly NATO, and it's partly a lot of people are discussing today is also looking into a closer Nordic cooperation on how we cooperate on these expensive capabilities that you might not need that many of, but you still need to have in your toolbox.
And from what I understand, a lot of these same refueling and sustainment problems also exist within the Norwegian Navy. So outside of its pretty limited submarine fleet, do you think it's going to have a lot of these same problems affecting it as well?
The new long-term plan for the defence, which was published last year, the biggest investment in Norwegian history is actually to buy an entirely new surface fleet, including frigates. We're buying new submarines from Germany. There are discussions of Poseidon and similar capabilities. So definitely there is a big focus on that part. So that part of the defense investments is going to take a huge chunk out of the money being used on defense in the next 10 years.
Do you think if given enough time and notice, though, that whilst Norway might not be able to take it back on day 1 or day 2, that the Norwegian military would be capable of putting a battalion on shore and retaking Svalbard back by force?
Well, that would depend on if it was 2 Russians in fishing clothes and an assault rifle, but if it was a substantial Russian force, that would be a difficult task. As I said earlier, you can always bring a battalion ashore at Svalbard, whether you're Russian or Norwegian, but to sustain them there over time in winter conditions is going to be a huge drain on your logistics, and it's going to be really, really challenging when the cost of keeping just your force in place will be substantial.
Well, I guess this brings us to our main question at the moment, which is what would NATO's response be to this, particularly in recent times where tensions have grown between the United States and the rest of NATO. As whilst it was always going to be somewhat difficult to get NATO on board for something like this, as some states like Hungary might not go along with the consensus, in recent times not even the United States seems to be on board with this. With things becoming so frosty between Washington and Oslo, that even just a few days ago the Norwegians refused to allow a US ship to refuel using a Norwegian port. So within the situation we find ourselves at the moment, if we did see something like this, what do you think the NATO response would be?
That is hard to forecast. And in the end, there's no set play for these things. I think that is being done as it goes along by the decision makers. But definitely, it's one of the things that where you have a feeling whether the alliance cohesion is strong and you can live with that short setback and how that plays off afterwards, or whether you need action further on. There's been a few crises between Norway and Russia. During the Cold War, there was a Russian aircraft that actually crashed on Svalbard that both the Russians and Norwegians wanted to retrieve, and there was a standoff between the Norwegian Coastal Guard and Soviet vessels. So these things have happened and flared up where both parties have acted quite decisively without actually starting a shooting war. I think we've seen a lot of these unattributed and partly attributed actions from Shadow Fleet or from hybrid threat damaging and actually threatening the sort of subsea underwater infrastructure. There has been terms done in NATO and in Norway nationally to get better control, have a baseline for how it looks, and to keep better tabs on the different threats that goes into that. If you want to do an initial strike, you have a long border with Finland to worry with, and Finland in the north is mainly a maritime power. And it's traditionally, from a NATO point of view, big threat was the Kola complex with the nuclear submarines of Russia and the danger of missile-guided nuclear subs slipping into the Atlantic and threatening the slocks across the Atlantic. That still more or less remains, I would say, the same. The Northern Fleet has largely been spared in Ukraine, but in particular in the land and air domain, that has changed the balance of power conventionally.
So obviously there are going to be questions around a NATO response, and undoubtedly if NATO partners start shooting at Russia, there's obviously a concern around nuclear war. But one of the other scenarios I've seen posted by other Nordic defense people, that instead of turning towards someone like NATO in this circumstance, they actually might turn toward forming a coalition of the Scandinavian states, bringing together nations like Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, and possibly even Estonia, to place some serious pressure on Russia, where the force can work together to do things like seal off the Gulf of Finland, or even work together to try and re-secure the archipelago without pushing Russia into a position where it feels its opponents may conduct a nuclear first strike. However, this option would also rely on these forces working well together. So how interoperable are these forces at the moment?
So it depends a bit on which domain you look at. So one of the big advantages, Finland, Sweden was already very NATO adapted before they actually joined NATO. We had common training exercises. We've served with Swedes and Finns in missions under both UN and NATO control abroad. And we obviously share, especially with Denmark, Sweden, we speak the same language. We can speak Swedish, Danish, Norwegian and understand each other. Finnish is a bit of a different kettle of fish. But we have a close alignment both culturally and everything else. That makes everything easier. In the land domain, special forces, they are highly interoperable. We've trained together regularly for the last 15, 20 years. We share the same doctrines, more or less. We share a lot of the same equipment. We use Swedish infantry fighting vehicles. We use the same Leopard main battle tanks, etc. Air Force is also more and more, and in particular the last few years, integrated. There has been a common air control center in the Nordic countries for several years, and they train regularly together. On the Navy side, it's a bit more split because there you go back to that Finland and Sweden is mainly operating in the Baltic Seas and the Norwegian Navy mainly operating in the Norwegian and Barents Sea. So that is basically divided by the Scandinavian peninsula. But they are also, in my understanding, I'm not a naval officer, but in my understanding, they're also, compared to other NATO nations, quite well capable of operating together with each other.
Now, while this is an interesting scenario, and one that could raise a lot of political questions for NATO in the future, and even potentially expose some fractures within the alliance, as a strategic operation, many would probably feel that taking Svalbard is simply just not worth the trouble, as even if Russia were to deploy 150 or 300 troops to the archipelago, keeping those Russian forces supplied and operational, especially if Scandinavian nations begin targeting Russian supply convoys, is likely to prove both costly and counterproductive. Beyond that, the archipelago seems to also hold very little strategic value, as Russia already has ample natural gas reserves within its own territory, with these deposits also costing far less to extract out of the ground. Combined with the fact that Russia possesses much better missile positions in Trefoil and some of its other Arctic installations, and it makes Svalbard a somewhat impractical military asset. And for Moscow, you'd be carrying out all of this at the risk of getting significant political backlash or reuniting Europe against Russia. And in a worst-case scenario, Russia could even see Finland advance slightly into Russia, cutting the one train line that connects Murmansk to the rest of the country. So while I'm sure there will always be debate over Svalbard's significance, I'm going to pose the question to you, that if you were a Russian defense planner sitting in the Kremlin, is taking Svalbard really worth it?
There's really not much of strategic importance to gain on Svalbard. The main threat for the Russians, regardless, is still an attack by the US over the North Pole, basically, which is the shortest way to fly missiles from the US towards Moscow and Russia. And that has already been covered by some of the bases they've built, such as Nagoskoye and others, on the islands north of Russia mainland. And Svalbard in itself, you get some more air defense systems, SSC-5s or 6 coastal defense missile batteries in that area, but really not much that you can't do with surface action groups or anything else. And by doing so, gained a huge logistical problem. That you're going to resupply that force that you have in an area where nothing grows, there's not much population or infrastructure, you have few harbors and only one functioning, rather small airfield. So the risk is probably bigger than the gain in that case.
So we come to the end of 3 fairly different scenarios and 3 fairly different points of analysis. And at least for me, what I ended up discovering is that all 3 have some fairly common underlying factors. First being that, well, for one, the math doesn't seem to quite match the rhetoric. That whilst we do see these endless articles about the region and talk of Arctic grand strategy, the moves here are mostly fairly marginal. That when it comes to Russia expanding and opening a new base, it is true. And it is something we should keep an eye on, but we should also probably take into account that, well, that base only has 150 personnel, which is probably not going to tip the balance of power anytime soon. That whilst there is all this talk about the strategic importance of Greenland and its central position within the Arctic, well, unless Denmark, the United States, or Greenland were looking to invest massive amounts of money into it, it's probably not going to make a huge difference to our current position. As if we were looking to put pressure on the Russian Arctic position, well, we're going to get a hell of a lot more bang for our buck using Finland and Sweden rather than Greenland for that one. The whilst we hear all this talk about millions of barrels of oil sitting just underneath the Greenland surface, there's also millions of barrels of oil in other places in the world, and a whole bunch of other spots on the planet we simply just don't use, mostly because it's economically inefficient to do so. That I'd probably place my bet that if the US were desperate for oil, they'd probably go looking at Venezuela before they start looking at Greenland. That while most people assume that grand strategy is being debated in large rooms with expansive maps, in all honesty, it's probably being decided by depressed people in dimly lit rooms with Excel spreadsheets. Now, does this mean that we won't see any invasion of Greenland or Svalbard? Well, no, that doesn't mean that won't happen. If you look around at the state of the world at the moment, all bets are on the table. And when it comes to governments, they don't always do the most fiscally efficient thing. But if I was the government and I wanted to gain a better position in the Arctic or gain better access to rare earths, there are plenty of other options all across the world I could probably go for, most of which also wouldn't involve me breaking decade-long alliances. So in short, when it comes to the Arctic and today's politics, all bets are off. But when it comes to finance and the boring insurance guys, that's where I keep my bet on. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. I can tell you, this episode has been an absolute nightmare to put together, as it's an episode that's been in production now for nearly 2.5 months. You see, originally we wrote this to be a wargaming of just an invasion of Svalbard, before the episode slowly morphed into an episode about the economics of the Northeast Passage, to then having to pivot again to respond to Trump's claims over Greenland, to then have to change it again to respond to the elections. So all in all, there is so much that didn't make the final cut, and the entire script for this has been rewritten a whole bunch of times. But it's out now, and we hope you enjoy it. Now, if you're one of the people who did like it and you want to see more content like this, well, you can do so by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Butterman2, Jen Nordsberg, Laura Keane-Morris, Al Moteri, Willie Maguire, Chucky, Logan, and Matthew Duncan. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we cannot thank them enough. So if you feel you could spare a couple of dollars and you want special access to our full video presentations and maps exploring topics like the likely outcomes of a 2024 renewal of the Russo-Georgian War, or a full personnel briefing on the people closest to Putin, as well as some of our other upcoming live streams, you can do so by following the links in the description. But for now, this episode on the Arctic is all thanks to you guys. As usual though, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first being Red Arctic, Russian Strategy Under Putin by Elizabeth Buchanan, for a better understanding of Russia's overarching strategy here in the north. The second being The Arctic and World Order by Christina Spohr, for a bit of a wider geopolitical view of the region as a whole. And the third is Mountain Warfare and Cold Weather Operations by the Asymmetric Warfare Group, for a more military-focused understanding of the Arctic as a battle space. I want to say thanks to this week's guests, Jennifer Spence, Nicholas Juan, and Sigbjorn Halsny, who were fantastic to work with on this one. I'd also like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers of this piece, them being Andrew Gundel, Gabriel Lane, Jamie Tanu, Raul Devanarayanan, Nate Ostilla, Jemima Pentreath, and Lorenz van Kierbilk. On top of those guys, I'd like to thank the rest of my team as well, them being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Juvella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz van Kierbilk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundel, John Luke Davenport, Scott Missler Ferguson, and Sean Cotter Lem, our research assistants and writers. Jamie Tano, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vorgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. These guys are the backbone of this team, and we're so thrilled to be back in these ever crazy times. But to round out the episode, the Red Line will be back in a few weeks. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.